Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel. We're very pleased that you chose to spend these moments with us today, and we're aiming to pick out some key points from the passage. So you don't have to have a Bible with you to look at the passage, but if you've got one, I'm sure you will enjoy looking back at previous references and things. My name is David Payne, and I'll be your host for this, the 61st episode. Can you believe that, Steph? In our journey through Mark's Gospel. Today, we are delighted to have Ted Trost with us. Got yet another new guest, Steph. Where do you find them? I don't know. Ted is Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama. He's written a master's thesis on Mark's Gospel. So, you know, I think I'm fairly confident in believing what he says. But this is really interesting. He's working on a commentary of Mark's Gospel called The Gospel of the Unnamed. Really welcome. Really warm welcome to you, Ted. The Gospel of the Unnamed, what's that? What's that about?
The argument for the book is that the gospel is really designed to elevate the last and the least as they're represented in Mark's gospel, and these people are almost invariably unnamed in Mark's gospel. So I want to focus on the stories of the unnamed. Simon's mother-in-law would be the first example, who after she's healed by Jesus turns around and starts serving others. She's paradigmatic for the people that I'm interested in looking at.
Fantastic, brilliant. And I think we met you at Edinburgh. That's the connection you have with Steph. Did you enjoy the production? So it was the Fringe last summer 2022 at the Edinburgh Fringe, and we met you there, which is great.
Yes. I was on a sabbatical, and I was working on some of this Gospel of the Unnamed. And some other projects of having to do with violence in America and the Beatles, and had the opportunity to see Stefan's presentation. I went with my sons during the Fringe, and we started a conversation that's continuing till today.
Oh, brilliant. It's really great to have you. And at this point, I usually say everyone knows Steph, so I won't introduce him. But it's possible that we've got people who listening who haven't met you or don't know much about you. Would you like to tell us about why you're doing what you're doing and what I Am Mark is all about?
I Am Mark is a solo word-for-word dramatization of Mark's Gospel. When it's done in full, it is the whole thing, but normally I do a slightly truncated version. I did it at the Edinburgh Fringe, as Ted just said. And why I do it, because I love it. At least the more I look at it, the more I perform it, the more I fall in love with it. The more I do this podcast, the more I want to read. It's just the most exhilarating ride in my spiritual life so far. And all I can say is recommend this podcast to you, and indeed Mark's Gospel in general.
Thank you. And in case people missed it at Edinburgh last year, can they see you again?
Yeah, I'll actually be at Edinburgh again this year. Thanks for that nice plug there. Good
2023.
David. Yeah. So from the 7th through to the 19th of August, I'll be at Charlotte Chapel near Princes Street in Edinburgh, and won't be there on every day, but most days in those dates. And so I look forward to seeing you if you happen to be there.
Great, thank you. Now, we all know you. We know you both. So thank you and welcome to the podcast. Today's passage is entitled Jesus' Trial Before Pilate. We're in the last week of Jesus' life on earth. He's been betrayed, arrested in the middle of the night, then questioned by the high priest, and a long passage about Peter denying him. And now it's time for his trial.
Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of? But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him!" they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
We're going to try and look at a few points then and incorporate some questions and thoughts from Question Mark Facebook group. First question that came from the group, that was me actually, but why were the chief priests and other religious leaders so opposed to Jesus? We're familiar with the story and we probably know the outcome, but it does seem extreme for them to want him to be killed, at least to our 21st century minds, doesn't it? Do you want to start with that, Ted?
Sure, that's a great question. Jesus encounters opposition almost from the start of Mark's gospel. And by chapter 3, the Pharisees conspire with the Herodians to destroy him in the one version of the text. And this is because he undermines their authority. People ask, what is this? A teaching with authority? They're not used to that. The leader's authority is being undermined by Jesus's activity. This becomes very clear when he comes to Jerusalem itself. First of all, the crowd seem to be on Jesus's side. So they say Hosanna and so forth and welcome him. And he comes to the temple, and the temple is this institution that polices the relationships among the Romans and the Jews. So the temple collects money that is subsequently given to the Romans. So the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes are part of this larger system that Jesus says is corrupt. He undermines their whole existence. This is very clear in chapter 12 when a young scribe asks Jesus, "What's the greatest commandment?" And he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe responds, "You have spoken rightly. This is more important than all the rituals of the temple." That's the end. That's the end of the temple right there. Okay. And that's why Jesus is a threat to these people. He goes on to point to a woman who puts a tiny little coin in the treasury and says she's given more than all these other people. So the economy of the temple is under threat because of the things that Jesus says and does. And historically speaking, the temple itself has been destroyed anyways. So the question then arises, what was the worth of that institution among the people who were followers of Jesus, but Jews? And the response that Mark's gospel makes is, you don't need the temple. You just need Jesus.
Wow. Do you want to add to that, Steph?
No, that's a fantastic answer. I love that. Thank you very much, Ted.
Sure.
Okay, you get onto your points now then. So what you want to say. Steph, what do you want to say?
What I want to say about this passage or about the question?
Yeah, about the passage.
About this passage, I think for me, as I read it again, it's the question of how to perform it actually, or really and truly what actually is going on. Why do people act in certain ways? How do they say the words that are ascribed to them? What do they mean? And in every passage in Mark's gospel, I've got to get my head around those sorts of questions. And this one is particularly difficult. It's all sorts of uncertainties actually on first reading.
And
so
then also present it to other people, present it to the audience.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got to be firm in my own mind about what
Yes.
it means, or
Yes.
at least have an idea. I'm not pretending to know absolutely, that I know exactly what it means and everyone else is wrong, but I need to have some idea. And unless I do, it becomes very difficult to convey something meaningful to the audience. You're right, absolutely right. So that's what's so intriguing, because there are all sorts of questions in my mind, which we really do need to answer. They deserve an answer. For example, why does Pilate say, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And how does he say it? Is it with respect? Is it mocking? Is there something else going on? What sort of tone of voice? Because that is crucial in understanding his role. And there are other parts in this story as well, which have a similar difficulty, it seems to me.
We better have some answers. Ted, have you got some answers for us?
Yeah, well, several. Let me start with focusing on the issue of King of the Jews, and say that you perform earlier an exchange with a King of the Jews, that is Herod, who sentences to death John the Baptist. This is in chapter 6 of Mark's Gospel. And I think we're dealing with a similar issue here. The issue is the arrogance or the indifference of power. And so Herod is being criticized by John the Baptist for his marital arrangement with his brother's wife. But he doesn't want to do away with John because John amuses him. Nevertheless, when he invites his daughter to dance for him, which seems kind of an odd thing, he promises that he'll give her up to half of his kingdom if she performs this dance. And he makes this oath in front of other people. And she asks for John's head on a platter, and he's a little disappointed because John amuses him, but nevertheless, to keep his oath to the others, he has John executed. That's the indifference of the power structure as it's presented in Mark's Gospel. So one answer to your question is take Herod as a cue. That's how power operates. And Pilate is part of the same power system, because Herod answers to Rome, and Pilate is a representative of Rome, and he's in Jerusalem to make sure that there's not disorder during the festival. So in the case of Pilate, your question, where does this King of the Jews idea come in, is an intriguing one. Where did he get that idea? That Mark's not clear on this. In Mark's Gospel, in chapter 14, the previous chapter, Jesus is condemned by the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes, because he is asked, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" His response is, "I am." He identifies himself with this name of God. And then he goes on to say something about the fate of the Son of Man. But it's on Jesus's mention of the words "I am," he's saying God's name, that they convict him of blasphemy. Right? So that's what they've got on him. But apparently that's not what they tell Pilate is wrong. Because that's not a very good argument. I mean, the Roman, he doesn't care if Jesus is claiming to be a Jewish God. That's no harm to him. But somehow this language about King of the Jews has crept in.
Yes.
And Mark doesn't tell us how it got there. But that's suggestive of a power struggle. If there's an alternative King of the Jews to the one that they've paid off, i.e. Herod, then Rome might be in trouble.
Yeah.
And so possibly I would think we have to speculate here, because there's a gap in the text, and you have to, as a dramatist, you have to figure this out. But it seems to me that we've switched from blasphemy, because what does Pilate care about blasphemy, to this alternative king, and that's a problem. That's a problem in a time when there are competing political forces. Barabbas is identified as an insurrectionist later in this text. So there is a possibility of revolution in the air. And as a consequence, Pilate doesn't want to hear anything about that. But of course, Jesus says, and that's, I'm not even going to get involved in this conversation. That's not who I am. I'm not going to say anything about it.
That's the other question, Ted, about Jesus's reply. But just coming back to what you were saying, I totally agree and understand that now, that the idea is that the King of the Jews has a political edge, which isn't in the confession of Jesus earlier on before the high priest. That's a different order of kingship. And of course, from Pilate's point of view, that's a threat to say King of the Jews. I'm just wondering how he says, are you the King of the Jews? Is it with disdain? Is it with mockery? Is it with fear? There are all sorts of possibilities with the tone. But I love the other point you made just there about Jesus's reply, because for me, I think it's a bit equivocal what Jesus says. Yes, it is, as you say. It seems to be saying, no, that's nothing to do with me. On the other hand, he is saying at the same time to be saying, it is actually something to do with me. So there's an affirmative and a negative going on at the same time. So I'm just wondering whether Jesus is agreeing with the fact that he is a king, but he's not a king of the Jews in the way that Pilate says, or the Pilate thinks. He's not a political king. He's a king in another way, completely beyond Pilate's understanding.
Well, yes, okay. That's one approach. In my opinion, Jesus is not interested in kingship. He's interested in the kingdom of God.
Yeah,
that's what's happening right now. God's kingdom has intervened. That's what he's been saying since the beginning, and he's inviting people to participate in this kingdom. Repent and believe in the good news, or believe in the gospel. That is, enter into this story world would be one way to talk about it. The woman who anoints Jesus with oil has entered into that story world. Why? Because she has prepared him beforehand for burial, not for kingship, for burial. She understands that that's the fate of the Son of Man, contrary to Peter, who doesn't like that narrative trajectory. Jesus rejects this title of king. He doesn't want to be the son of David. How could he be the son of, why does David call the Messiah Lord? He asks in chapter 12, and the answer is he can't be David's son if David calls him Lord. So the whole idea of a Davidic style kingship, etc., is foreign to Jesus's way of thinking. Jesus's idea of kingdom doesn't have anything to do with towering over other people.
No.
The image for it is a weed. It's the mustard weed in chapter 4 that grows democratically all over the Galilean countryside.
Yeah.
That's the kingdom of God. It's not the tall cedar tree that towers above all others. And so this king of the Jews narrative, I think my guess would be here that just as Pilate understands that the chief priest and so forth are jealous of Jesus, he sees right through that. I think Pilate understands that they're just making stuff up.
I see.
To try to get rid of Jesus.
Even from the beginning. So he understands it even from the beginning. Understood. Yeah, it's really good.
That's what that would be my guess.
Yeah.
That Pilate understands that, and so I would maybe even if I were playing with this, I would say Pilate says, "Are you the so-called King of the Jews?"
Yes.
Because he sees that that's just a rhetorical technique on the part of these people that he has to get along with at one level, but he doesn't really respect the chief priests and scribes and elders. They have an economical arrangement that needs to be maintained, but he doesn't. He sees what they're up to. They just want to get rid of Jesus, and they want him to do it.
Yeah.
So because if they do it, that causes problems with other people who have been following Jesus, and that's why they decide subsequently to rile up the crowd. They realize that it's the threat of the crowd that will really convince Pilate to do what they want him to do.
Yeah, I guess Pilate is the only one who can kill Jesus anyway. I mean, they're not allowed to commit a capital crime, or are they? Well,
that's I think that's an unclear. We were talking about this earlier. off camera, that if you're familiar with Monty Python and the stoning of blasphemers, stoning was a possibility. Certainly in the book of Acts, Stephen is stoned. So there is some authority to put people to death. But I think the problem for the chief priests is that putting Jesus to death would focus the wrath or the reaction on them. They don't want that, because that causes dissension among their supporters and among their followers and among the people who they tax and among the people who come to the temple.
And up to now, the crowd have actually been very positive towards Jesus, haven't they?
Exactly.
So,
yes.
And the chief priests recognize that, and they're afraid of them. So it doesn't make sense to kill him themselves. Yeah.
They know they have to manipulate the crowd somehow, and they have to get Herod to do Pilate to do their dirty work.
Yeah.
And that's that's lurking behind this encounter.
So interesting. At this stage, can I introduce one of our listeners' questions? Gareth is a faithful friend on Facebook question mark group, and he says the chief when he looks at this passage, he sees Karpman drama triangles everywhere: victor, victim, and villain. The chief priests see themselves as victims of the villain Jesus and call on the victor Pilate to solve the problem. I know you've read the rest of the question. There's quite a lot to it. I just wonder what you think about that, or whether you think Jesus doesn't take part at all and he's not involved in the triangle, or what do you make of that, Ted?
Can I go first? Is that all right? And then
what do you make of that, Ted?
Thank you. I mean, I was thinking from a drama point of view, what's interesting to me is the idea that this is like a repetition of a previous scene. Not so much that the main structure here isn't so much what's going on within the scene as in what's happened already in the story. And in fact, there are probably two scenes, I think, that this is a repetition of. There's the trial of Herod, the trial of John the Baptist, as Ted's just described it. There's also Jesus's trial for the Sanhedrin and the chief priests. And it's almost the same. If you look at the text, it's like a little changes, but basically it's a mirror of the trial in the previous chapter. So that's what's interesting from a dramatic point of view. And I'm not really sure you can also ascribe a particular persona to the individuals, the protagonists in this story. For me, Pilate is a fluctuating villain, if you like, because he is on the one hand the one who puts Jesus to death. He is on that hand too, he's the one who's indifferent to Jesus, as Ted explained. But at the same time, he does actually speak up for Jesus. So there's a kind of moving backwards and forwards in terms of our estimation of him. So I'm not so sure about drama triangles, but I'm fascinated by the idea of structure anyway in the text.
Yeah, I agree with the move to the dramatic analysis of the various motivations, because I do think, as in all drama, they switch. They aren't fixed. Yeah. We have to also deal with the fact that this is the identification of Jesus as victim here seems to me to be a bit strained, because Jesus knows that this is the way the story is supposed to go at a certain level. That this is he has somehow brought together, I think, what I would say is the from the Hebrew Bible, the notion of the Son of Man as he appears in the clouds of glory and receives the honor from the nations, with the suffering servant of Isaiah who endures tribulation on behalf of the nation, or is the nation itself in the Hebrew Bible, at least. This becomes part of who Jesus says the Son of Man is, and that story includes being handed over to this constabulary, to being arrested, tried, killed, and then resurrected. So there's resurrection comes at the end, which is nice, but there's this other stuff in between, and Jesus accepts that is his narrative. So he's not a victim here in the traditional sense. On the other hand, he is a victim in the sense of experiencing the indifference of power as most people experience it. That is to say that, we look at this and say, well, thank goodness I'm not Barabbas, or I'm not wrested off the street and thrown in jail like Jesus has, like what's happened to Jesus. But in fact, the indifference, the arrogance of power during Jesus's time is what's at stake here. And Jesus then, as God's representative, or even ego eimi, as God himself, undergoes what the least of these in their culture, but then I would say also our culture, experience. People tossed in jail, people who experience the power manipulation and have no voice. Jesus is undertaking that role in this text, and but not as victim, as someone in solidarity with humanity. Humanity at its most basic form, because after all, that's what it means to be last of all and slave of all. And so this kind of radical overturning of the way the world operates is the kind of kingdom Jesus is inviting people to participate in. And that, again, that's why I don't like the language of Jesus as King of the Jews, because that's not what his kingdom looks like at all. I think Acts catches this nicely when it describes Jesus's followers as people who are turning the world upside down. That's exactly what happens. If you think of a pyramid with like the king on top and the normal people down here on the bottom, and there's a lot of them down there. What the Gospel of Mark does is turn that upside down.
Brilliant.
Steph, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's fantastic. I think for me, I have a slight disagreement about and it's a nuanced one about kingship, but we can come back to that on another day, Ted.
Yeah.
I think the other questions around the drama are, what's going on with Barabbas? I think that's another huge question. I remember talking about this when I first actually performed this in my own school assembly. One of my colleagues came up to me and said, "You know what Barabbas means, don't you?" And then he began to explain that from his point of view, Barabbas was a villain, and Jesus was totally innocent, and Jesus was exchanged for the one who was evil. And he suggested that that's basically a kind of a sign for us, an indication of what Jesus did on the cross, that he died for us, our sinful humanity, and he was the innocent one who took our place. Now, I remember at the time feeling, actually, yeah, that sounds really plausible. But the more I look at it, and the more I look at Mark's gospel, the less I think that's likely. And for me, the whole question of Barabbas is the interesting one. It's because what is it about Barabbas that was so attractive to the crowd? Why do the chief priests get away with it? They stir up the crowd to get him to release Barabbas instead. It seems to me, from the language that was used, the fact that Barabbas is called an insurrectionist, that he had committed murder in the uprising, suggests he is a political revolutionary of one kind or another. And for the Jews at that time, at Passover, when nationalistic fervor would have been quite pumped up, to appeal to that element in the crowd was a really good tactic on the part of the chief priests. So it's possibly, we speculate, that's the reason. And why it's important is not because of some degree of, is it a kind of an indication of penal substitution? I don't find that at all. What I think is important about that is about the kind of kingdom, for want of a better word, that Jesus represents, which is the opposite of trying to wrest power by force and by violence, which is what what Barabbas symbolizes. Jesus is someone who is completely non-violent and brings in a completely different kind of kingdom. It's a bit like what Ted was saying about the way in which God's way of doing things completely upends our human way of thinking. So yeah, that's what my thought is. I don't know what Ted had to say about that.
I pretty much agree with you. I'd point out that when Jesus is arrested in the garden, it's time to put away the sword. He submits to that arrest. He's abandoned by all of his disciples, but he undergoes arrest, and then this story unfolds. As far as one can't from where I stand or sit at the moment, one can't hear the word insurrectionist and not think about what happened in the capital of Washington, D.C. on Epiphany, January 6th, 2020. And this was also in the name of nationalism. So I think you're right on there. And certainly in Mark's time, again, I date the writing of Mark to be after 70, very soon after 70, very soon after the temple is destroyed, because that creates great anxiety among Jesus's followers, many of whom were the headquarters of the movement at the time was Jerusalem, and gathering in the courts of the temple. So now that the temple is destroyed, what do we do? And the temple was destroyed because of insurrectionists like Barabbas, and the Romans came in and just destroyed the place. So yeah, I think you're exactly right that Barabbas rings those bells as a nationalist hero, and that is how, ironically, the chief priests and scribes are able to stir up the crowd. And I say ironically because that's ultimately, historically speaking, what leads to the destruction of the temple itself.
And that's why it's so important, isn't it, to read Mark's gospel in the context it was written in, as much as it's describing Jesus's time, because the context it was written in, as you rightly say, is around probably after the destruction of the temple. And these ideas about revolution and so on are very, very current and painful, actually, for the people. And Mark's pointing out that this way of revolution is not the way, it's not God's way. That what God wanted, who Jesus is the kind of Messiah which is against this idea of a nationalistic figure who's going to free the people from oppression.
And practically speaking, Mark's gospel is saying, don't be disturbed about the absence of the temple. You don't need the temple. You've got Jesus. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee. Follow him. That's all you need. Get out of Jerusalem. You don't need the temple. You don't need this stuff. It's destroyed, yes, but it was already destroyed in the middle of chapter 12 when the scribe said that love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself is the great commandment that undermines everything else that happens in the temple. The temples, and then next comes chapter 13, where Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. So Mark is reassuring about this revolution that has occurred unsuccessful insurrection that Barabbas perhaps represents in this text, as a failed way, historically speaking, to deal with Roman rule.
I think it's interesting from my point of view that in chapter 13, Jesus prophesies about the insurrection to some extent, and says, if you hear someone say, I'm the Messiah, don't follow them. And I'm wondering, for me, whether I could date the writing of Mark's gospel as just before the destruction of the temple, as in Mark is writing to warn people who are believing in this idea of the Messiah being some kind of nationalistic figure. No, you got it completely wrong. But I totally agree with your view in general terms there. But I'm just wondering, Ted, about what it means for us as 21st century people. You mentioned the insurrection at Capitol Hill very recently, but what is this idea of violence versus non-violence, or God's kingdom versus the kingdom of power, which we've been talking about? What's that got to do with us? Can you answer that question?
Well, this is something I've been giving some thought about, because it's a recurring theme in Mark's gospel, but then it's also a bad interpretation of this, I think, is central to, in my case, American identity. That is this idea that one ventures out on his or her own and makes a name for oneself. And just, I don't mean to get political here, but the sort of paragon of this, the primary example of this would be someone who puts their own name on everything they touch. Buildings, stakes, vineyards, universities, and so forth. So we have this notion of greatness, in other words, that involves making a name for yourself.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm so interested in the unnamed characters in Mark's gospel, because they're not about that. They're about something else. They're about, the best example of this is in chapter 9, when the disciples argue on the road who is the greatest among them, right? They have just had an unsuccessful encounter with a young man who writhes on the ground from perhaps epileptic fits. None of them were able to exorcise the demon, and now they're asking who is the greatest among them. This is the irony, is classic Mark, and Jesus says that humility is the answer to who is the greatest. You must be last of all and servant of all. And then they say, oh, that's an interesting idea. By the way, we saw this guy casting out demons in your name, and we made him stop. And here, again, Mark's irony, this guy, unnamed, is doing exactly what they were unable to do. He's exercising people successfully. He's doing the work of the kingdom, and not telling anybody his name even. And they make him stop because he hasn't been authorized by their committee of insiders. So to me, it says this notion that you have to make a name for yourself, to individualize, that greatness is what we think of as being great. America has this huge problem about policing the world and so forth. To me, this seems like way off track in comparison to what the Gospel of Mark has to offer us as a paradigm of greatness.
That's brilliant, Ted. And just to add a little bit of a note to that, not something I've thought through carefully enough yet, but it's something that's intrigued me. In reading about this passage and preparing for the podcast, I came across this idea by a guy called Blumenschein, who talks about how Jesus represents this non-violent approach to evil, and the other approach is to take a violent approach. In other words, you use violence to justify. You justify it because it's against evil, and that's the way human beings generally try to deal with evil. But Jesus has a completely different view. I'm fascinated by that. I must say, it makes me wonder, a bit like your comment, that we've basically got it all wrong in the way we lead our lives and the way in which we organize ourselves politically. That we seem to want to do things the wrong way, and Jesus is telling us or showing us a completely different way of doing things, completely different way of life.
Well, I think
against us, gentlemen, we're running out of time. Unless you want one last point, Ted.
Well, I would just say that subsequently is what Jesus means by saying what the great commandments are. Yes. And that's what love your neighbor as yourself implies. You're not gonna stab yourself in the heart. You wouldn't do that, and you shouldn't do that to your neighbor either.
Wow. Wow, brilliant.
How absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Ted and Stefan. Thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with us. It's been a lot of fun and completely enlightening, as it always is. And we've enjoyed having you with us too, lovely listener. We hope you'll check out the website, iam-mark.com, and the Facebook community. But that's all we have time for today. So it's goodbye from Ted Trost in Alabama.
Yes.
And goodbye from Stefan Smart in Southampton.
Bye.
And from me until next time, goodbye. Thank you for coming.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.